Hello and welcome back. In parts 1 to 3 of this series, we looked at how to set up the Photoshop workspace to work effectively when processing photographs. And in this part 4, we're going to take a look at the most important part of the Photoshop working environment, and that's the Layers panel. And if you learn nothing else from this series, working with the Layers panel and understanding how layers and adjustment layers work, it's the single most important aspect of working in Photoshop. So let's jump in and see how it all works. So to the Photoshop workspace and the Layers panel, and what we'll do is we'll zoom in so that we can see this a little clearer, and by zooming in on this we can see all of the elements. Now the first thing to note that if you're not seeing these icons in this format, come down to an empty space on the Layers panel, right mouse click, and then you can change the size of the thumbnails. Now I've gone for the largest available so that we can see exactly what we've got. So firstly we have the different layers displayed here. We have an eye symbol on each one to determine whether they're visible or not, and if we come down to the base layer, hold down the Alt key, click on that, we can turn all of those layers off. And let's then have a look at the different types of layers that we can use in Photoshop. So we have our background layer that's always called background when you open an image, and it always has a padlock on it so that we don't touch that. And the essence of working in Photoshop is that we use non-destructive editing, which means we never directly affect our background or base image. And so everything we do is with an adjustment layer, and these are adjustment layers of different types. And right up here we have another image based layer, which is when we use something like the Nik filters or any of those other plugin filters, it will create another copy of the background layer and apply the settings to that. So we have our background layer, and we can access or create these various types of adjustment layers either through this little icon down on the bottom of the Layers panel. If I click on that, it will give me a number of options for the different types of adjustment layers, or I have up here on the side of this menu panel, I have shortcuts for all of the different adjustment layer types. And these are adjustment layers of various types, and the little symbols denote the type of adjustment layer they are. This is a curves adjustment layer, this is a hue saturation layer, and another one, another curves, and there are a number of different types. And when we create an adjustment layer, by default, each of those adjustment layers is created with a mask. And the mask allows us to determine where on the photograph the adjustment is going to appear. And when we have a mask filled with white, it means that the effect is going to be visible across the whole of the image. And we can invert that mask so that it affects nothing on the image, which isn't much point in having that, but we can also then selectively paint onto that mask to reveal or conceal areas where we don't want the effect to take place. And of course we mentioned the eye symbols. We've got each of these adjustment layers, and if I turn that adjustment layer on and off, and maybe what we should do is zoom back out so that we can see the whole of the image. I've made an adjustment layer here. When I click on the actual adjustment layer icon, I can see here this is a curves adjustment layer where I've adjusted the tonality of the image by bringing in the black point on this end and applying a slightly increasing contrast curve to the image. And what I've done here, I've selectively applied it just to the sky. So when I turn that adjustment layer off and on, you'll see that it really only affects the sky. And we'll discuss how we can make those selections in maybe the next video. So adjustment layers have a type of adjustment and a mask, and consequently I have made a further adjustment here using a hue saturation luminance adjustment layer. And what I've done here, I think, is taken the saturation of the blue area back down, because when I added the curves layer to add contrast to the sky, you'll see that the color became too intense. And what I've done now is I've reduced the intensity of the blue and then using an option we call a clipping mask, I've applied this color adjustment purely to the sky on the layer below. Now the best thing that we can do now is just have a look at how adjustment layers work using a different sort of image so that we can visualize how this all works, because this is the area where most people find difficulty in understanding the principle of layers and masks. So let's open up another image and have a look at that. So let's have a look at this graphic that hopes to demonstrate how layers and adjustment layers work. So what I've tried to do here is I have an image at the bottom here, and I have a series of color filters or adjustment layers sitting above the image. And adjustment layers work very much like putting a filter over the lens of your camera. In the old days of film, we would use color correction filters. So you might put a warming filter on or a cooling filter, and that would change the way the light registered on the film. And in a similar way, when we put an adjustment layer above an image in Photoshop, that adjustment layer affects everything below it, and then we have the option of doing certain things with those adjustment layers. So this is basically how it works. And when we look at these adjustment layers, let's look at this one more closely. We have an adjustment where we've applied a curves adjustment, and we have a mask. And when we have a mask over the image that's not filled with white, then that mask is only affecting part of the image. And in creating this one, I made a selection of the sky, which we will cover in a later video. But if I hold down the Alt key, click on that mask, it now overlays that mask over the image so that we can see how the sky has been selected. And you'll see that there's a little bit of bleeding over the edges here. That's not so critical in this sort of a situation because we're just going to darken the sky, and it's not really that visible on parts of the building. So the adjustment layer is a way that we can really then apply specific adjustments without affecting the base image, but also applying it selectively if we want to. Now what we might do here is we might come up to the very top of this layer stack and we'll apply an adjustment layer, and I'll show how the masking is affected. And I'm going to come up to my little adjustment layers panel here, and these are all of the standard types provided by Photoshop. Some you will never use, and there's a couple of new ones that are just appallingly bad, such as the grain adjustment layer. I don't know who invented that, but that is just really bad. There are some other things like a gradient map or a threshold adjustment, posterization. You're probably never going to use those. But let's look at a different one that's easily visible, and that is a black and white adjustment layer. So if I click on that panel, it opens up my black and white adjustments, and you'll see here it's created a black and white adjustment layer, called it very conveniently black and white 1. And now we can see here we've got a bunch of settings here for each of the major color channels, and if I click on that default button there, I can look at a few different options. Let's say high contrast red filter is pretty dramatic, and if we turn that off and on, we can see that this filter, which turns the image to black and white, has affected the whole image. But let's say, what if I only wanted to selectively apply it? I've got a mask here. This is an easy way that we can visualize how the effect is of the mask. Currently it is full of white, and the simplest way to change how that works is to paint onto it with black or white. And over on our left hand tool panel we have a brush tool. If I click on that to select it, and then we have down here in our foreground and background colors, I have black and white, and black is sitting above the white, so that's the active color. And I've got some tools up here in this secondary panel that give me the size of my brush. Now, depending on whether you have the caps lock on or off, you can see either a crosshair, which isn't much use, or you can see the actual size of the brush. And I'm going to make that quite large, and I'm going to paint it with full opacity, and I'm going to then paint over the image so that you'll see where I'm painting. The mask is turning black, as you can see here, and that means that the color image below is coming through. Now this is not something you're actually going to do on an image like this, but it's really to demonstrate how we can change our masking to selectively apply adjustments to part of an image only. And of course that's now showing the colors coming through in the sky. But what if I wanted to change that? Well, because this is a mask and because I'm using a brush, I can very easily change this. I can bring white to the foreground and then paint back with white. And you can do it by clicking on this little two-ended arrow that will swap it over, or more conveniently, if you use the X key on your keyboard, you'll see here that it swaps those colors around. So I painted on with black initially. I'm going to now paint on with white again, and that's going to fill that back in, and you'll see that the areas that were black are now white again. And we can do this on and off, and of course we can do it with different opacity. So if I was to reduce that to roughly 50%, and let's go back to black by hitting the X key, I can paint with about 50% opacity. Let's bring a bit of color back into the trees. You'll see here, there's the mask, and if I hold down the Alt key, click on that mask again, we can overlay that mask over the image. So I've painted on with 50% of my brush, which means that it's going to, instead of painting on black, it's going to paint on grey, and at 50% opacity. And if I paint on that again with another 50%, it's going to go from 50 to 75, and then 75 to 100 and so forth. So I can build up the effect. Let's go back and hold down the Alt key, click on the mask again to bring our image back, and you can see here that I've now got full color here where I've painted several times, and I've got partial color where I've only painted lightly. And I've got some areas of sky visible with my black mask painted onto the image. Now again, this is not something you're going to do with this type of image, but it's purely to demonstrate how we can selectively apply an adjustment to just part of the image. Now, of course, if that was all we could do, that would be pretty good of itself, but there's a lot more to working with layers and adjustment layers in Photoshop. I'm going to turn this particular adjustment layer off because it's pretty horrendous, and let's go back down to this particular one here where we made an adjustment, and we can look at some of the other ways we can use these adjustment layers. So far we've just looked at the type of adjustment layers available, and we've looked at the masking, but there's much more. Firstly, we have what's called a blend mode, and by default when you create an adjustment layer, it is blended to what's called normal blend mode, which means that it directly affects the image below. But if you click on this little box area here, you can see that we have a number of different ways that the adjustment layer can be blended with the image below, and they form into different categories, but essentially they either lighten, darken, or add contrast, or do other things based on color. And the easiest way to understand how they work is to just take your mouse and hover over the different adjustment layers. And we can see here that we've got an adjustment layer that is darkening the sky. So what we're going to be looking at is what effect does it have. We can darken the sky. We can multiply. If you see multiply, it really darkens the sky. We can use a thing called color burn, linear burn, darker color, where it only affects the darker colors. And you can scroll all the way through these and have a look at how they affect the image. And most of them you're not going to use. You would use a normal, you'd use darken, you might use multiply, you would sometimes use lighten or screen, which is a lightening adjustment layer, or things like overlay, where it builds up the contrast of the image, soft light, and all the way down through here to hue, saturation, color, and luminosity. Now, not all of these blend modes are going to have an effect on every different type of adjustment you have, but these are tools that are available to help enhance the image that you're working on. So we have a type of adjustment, we have a mask, we have a blending mode, and finally we have an opacity. So by default, when we create an adjustment layer, it's put on at 100% opacity, But let's say that I've done this and I thought, yes, okay, it's fine, but it's a little bit overdone. Well, rather than going back and making further adjustments to this curve, the simple way would be to just click on this where it says 100%, and you've got a slider here. And this is pretty self-evident. At 100%, the effect is at full power. If we go down to 0, there is no effect. And so we can obviously dial in the amount of that adjustment from 0 to 100 and back. So adjustment layers, we have types, we have masks, we have a blending mode, and we have opacity. And when we combine all of those tools together, we have a really powerful way that we can amend the way our images look. So we've looked at the type of adjustment layers, the visibility of masking layers, masking, and so forth in a very general sense. But how would we start to look at an image when we open it in Photoshop from Lightroom? Well, let's go to a different photograph. This one has also been processed in Lightroom, so we've already enhanced the color and the tonality, but we might want to make some further adjustments. And let's just have a look at how we might use those adjustment layers to get a very different look to the image. And we're going to cover the options of making selections and masks in a further video, but let's just quickly look at how we might add a bit of contrast to the image. Now, many people would automatically go to the levels adjustment layer rather than the curves, because they find the curves a little bit intimidating. But basically, the levels adjustment layer is just a dumbed down version of using the curves adjustment. We have 3 sliders. We have a black point slider. If we move that in, we darken the image. If we move the white point slider in, we lighten it. And if we move the midpoint, we sort of adjust the contrast. So that does a few things, but it's fairly dumb, and it doesn't give us the flexibility that a curves adjustment layer does. So I'll turn that one off, and we'll go back and look at using the curves adjustment layer, because not only can we then look at moving the black point in as we did with the levels adjustment and the white point in, but we can then change the rate of change from dark to light. So if we pull this curve down by clicking and putting a point on that curve, we are now changing how the tones go from the darkest tones all the way through to the lighter tones. And we can apply lots and lots of different points on this curve, and we can create a custom look that really does give us much more flexibility in the way the image looks. So this is typically a curve that would increase the contrast on an image, an S curve. Let's turn that off, and we'll turn on the levels, and we'll do a similar thing with the levels. We'll move the black point in a bit, we'll move the white point in a bit, and we'll move that center point in. Yeah, you sort of get a slightly similar look, but you don't get as much control as you do with the curves layer. So it's important to choose the type of adjustment layer to give you the best effect. And once you get used to using the curves adjustment layers, you will very rarely use a levels adjustment. So finally, just to finish off this short video, let's quickly look at the sorts of adjustment layers that you're most likely to use in enhancing your photograph. So we have a color and vibrance adjustment layer, which is similar to what you'll find in Lightroom. Clarity and dehaze, you will probably also know that from Lightroom. The grain is an absolutely hideous filter, never use that. Brightness and contrast is, again, it's a dumb version of what we can do in curves, so I would never use that. And likewise, levels, again, that's a dumb version of curves. I would always use the curves. As the same with exposure, all that exposure adjustment layer does is brighten or darken the image, doesn't give you any options for contrast, so it's pretty well useless. But of course, what we would have is the hue saturation adjustment layer that allows us to look at not only as the different saturation of the different colors in the image, but also the lightness, and also we can do some very selective changes to the hues of those particular colors. So a hue saturation adjustment layer is quite likely to be used. We can use a color balance layer that allows us to make some fine-tuning adjustments to the color balance in an image. although it can get very quickly out of control, so you have to be very sparing in the way that you use that. We've already looked at the black and white adjustment layer. The photo filter adjustment layer, again, is a fairly blunt tool. It's equivalent to putting something like a warming or a cooling filter over your lens, and quite honestly, it's very limited in its use. I would use that very rarely. There's other ways that we can look at correcting the colors using adjustment layers, which we'll come into in another video. Channel Mixer allows us to get a little bit more sophisticated with adjusting the color intensities and the curves in different color channels, but again, that's something that's a little bit tricky to use. Color lookup tables is where you have a particular color look that you might want to add to your image. It's a limited area where that you can apply pre-programmed color looks to a photograph. Again, not something you're going to use an awful lot. Selective color, again, allows you to selectively adjust particular colors. An inversion adjustment layer is pretty well useless. We can do things without having to relate to that. Posterize, again, unlikely to use that. And threshold and gradient maps are also unlikely to be used. But one thing that Adobe has completely forgotten to do is they've missed out on another type of adjustment layer that we can apply by going through to our little menu panel down the bottom. We have all of these different ones here, but we don't have the solid color adjustment layer, and there is quite a number of times where you may want to add a particular color overlay onto an image, but Adobe in their wisdom don't give you that shortcut in this panel. So that's another thing that they could fix up. They could easily delete that horrible grain adjustment layer and put the solid color one in instead. So that's a basic introduction to working with layers in Photoshop. We'll cover more aspects of this in the next few videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again soon.